Headphones are in right now because Gen Z love cutting off their ears. It's a craze, it's a fad. I am not getting involved with furniture.
Not my
You know?
department. Shut up, Kim.
um,
EOS Utilities says, shut up, Kim.
over the past week, I've been finishing off the insane person exercise, which is what I decided to call it.
If you want to go down that route, that would be the Van Gogh. He was a bit insane, wasn't he?
The Van Gogh exercise, yeah.
Yeah, cutting off his own ear. I mean, you didn't go that far, did you? I mean, I can't see with your headphones. You got both ears?
There's a reason I started wearing these, actually.
Are you saying that's the whole, Beats headphones craze started because someone went full Van Gogh?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, headphones are in right now because Gen Z love cutting off their ears. It's a craze, it's a fad. Hang on. Okay, let me refocus.
I think we've got our intro right there.
Yeah. Okay.
We're cinematographers. What do you need ears for?
Normal cinematography podcast moment. All right, refocusing. For those who didn't listen or watch the last episode, whichever order we published these in, we were talking about composition and, more importantly, kind of rewording it in my brain as being arrangement. We were reprogramming me to kind of think about arrangement of subject and space and all these things. And at which point I confronted Kim and said that he should put together an exercise during the episode that would function on a repetitive basis under the kind of music practice philosophy that you've developed. And it worked a treat. It really did. It's an insane exercise. The bare bones of it was that I should construct out of bits of like card and foam this fake cinema screen, just a white background with a black frame, cut out some nondescript random geometric shapes, just like a bunch of squares, a bunch of circles, a bunch of triangles, a bunch of rectangles, and give myself 5 seconds to arrange them based on a certain emotion. I think there's a bit of work to do from like the way I approached it. I think I chose an emotion randomly and I did that 5 times. Whereas in hindsight, we now think that I could have instead chosen an emotion randomly every single time I changed. So instead of dedicating one day to fear, for example, I would go fear and then go, okay, now sadness. Okay, now, that kind of thing, like to make it more spontaneous. However, it was pretty spontaneous still. I think that I kind of came up with a pretty clear idea of what these arrangements meant to me based on a few of the basic things that you told me in terms of like looking direction and action lines, like moving the eye in a certain direction, certain rhythm. Yeah, I'm just going to run through those today briefly.
Cool.
I'll try to sum up how these emotional responses kind of appeared visually to me. I'm going to share my screen.
Let's do it.
And yeah, the reason I call this the insane person exercise is because in order to do it, I would have to excuse myself from whatever I was doing and go like, oh, I'm going to go in my room and like pull out my black and like white whiteboard and count down from 5 to myself while putting random shapes on it 5 times every day for the week. I looked ill and I was like, anyway, it's actually an elaborate hazing ritual. Okay, all right. Sadness. Now, the first one that we did together was sadness. We discussed some leading lines and conflict and so on and so forth. I discovered toward the end of the process that sadness also meant isolation in the frame. I actually can't explain a number of these. The way that I pictured this one was it was kind of, you know what? I'm not going to try and explain all these individually. I'm just going to sum up the trends to you. Yep. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. Here's the third one. And the fourth. And the fifth. Okay. General trends. One of which was basically stolen from you, is that the eye is hopefully being led downward and to the left.
Interesting. For me, it's probably, my eyes going generally across this, probably going more to camera right.
And up? Because that would be completely get rid of the purpose of...
It's still going down, but horizontally. My eyes pulling more towards camera right.
Anyway, in terms of intention and trends, I tried downward and to the left. In a number of these, the circle ended up being the subject, which I realized was kind of against the general abstract rule we were trying to pull off. But
yeah, at a certain point, it is what it is. I think with a lot of these exercises, the rules are there to give you constraints so that you're looking purely for the arrangement. Now, in the real world, we aren't creating images in that way. We are creating with an awareness of the subject, the content, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
At a certain point, yeah, we do want to kind of cross that boundary, but the reason for the rule and the abstractness in this exercise is more to kind of stop leaning on semantics and concentrate on structure and arrangement. As long as you're not leaning on the shape for a particular subject as the only way of communicating what you're doing, then yeah, that's fine.
Definitely wasn't the only way. I also noticed a trend of kind of isolating our circle in the frame, certain things like, especially this one, for example. There's also kind of a trend of obstructing right and forward movement. So looking over there kind of undesirable. So you got that, for example. This one, there's no implied movement at all. The way I see it, kind of just stationary, which I think kind of fit the sadness vibe. This one I think is too literal. It literally looks like a ball rolling down a hill in a certain direction. Like,
oh, okay, I see. Alrighty. I think part of what we're seeing differently in my head, I'm trying to see this in 3 dimensions with depth.
I was thinking about that. I was going, I don't know if I'm supposed to be seeing this.
Now that you said this, now if I flip my brain to 2D, now I see the rolling down the hill.
So my brain was in 2D when I did these. Just so you're aware.
I guess part of what kind of brings me that where I didn't see that rolling down the hill first was that triangle. It's a little bit like an arrow.
Yep.
So to me, then it's like things are coming towards me.
Oh, right.
So rather than being movement that way, it's movement that way.
Okay, I'm seeing it now. Yeah. Whew. All right.
Longer term, that's where we want to be.
It's hard. It's not a very easy part of my brain to unlock. On to our next emotion, which I believe was fear. Right. Fear and sadness are very similar. There are a number of negative emotions that I started on, and all of the trends are those I was trying to lead the eye downwards and to the left. I think for anger, it was upwards and to the left, I'm pretty sure. Or anyway, fear. Very similar. More obstruction. Kind of more of I think fear was the one that I can't sum up very well in terms of trends because it was so similar to sadness. I just kind of wanted more of the screen to be taken up. It was more obtrusive. There was much more to look at, but with the exception of that one, which I wouldn't have put it on the right side. I don't know why I did that, but I also thought, isolating something in the frame is scary, but didn't really work out here. My logic here was trapping something with something else on some side of the frame. In the way that you'd have if a character is being particularly intimidating, you'd have a dirty over where their shoulder would take up half of the frame. Fear is hard to sum up. What do you think?
I think in some ways that's actually good because I think that the more extreme emotions, if we can verbalize them, are we really going into the actual emotional part of that emotion, if you know what I mean? There are certain levels of emotions that are purely visceral and if you don't take them that far, if you limit yourself by verbalizing that emotion, are you really pushing it as far as is possible in a non-verbal medium?
I tried to fight this a lot for a number of negative, visceral emotions like fear and anger. You're going to notice more triangles because my brain was going, it needs to be spiky. Which defeats the purpose.
That's part of also where the choice of shapes is coming from. Circle is probably more balanced, harmonious, less aggressive. Triangles
Hence,
can be, like you say, more spiky and hence more aggressive. Square is kind of quite stable, whereas a rectangle has got a bit more angle potential.
Now that you bring that up, I've noticed a lot of especially low budget horror movies are very, very fond of triangles for some reason.
I think part of that goes back to German Expressionism.
Oh, all right. That makes sense.
So if you look at a lot of their shapes, and that goes back to Cubism as well, as completely unfounded theory, but just a purely personal observation, Cubism doesn't look like cubes to me. It looks like extremely low polygon 3D.
I see what you mean.
Particularly if you,
absolutely.
Particularly if you the one top right, which is a newer interpretation. Top right, that one. Does that not look like an extremely low polygon 3D?
Yeah, that's a Halo Combat Evolved model right there. That's from 2001.
When you start dividing up and counting, how many of those polygons are triangles?
Functionally, all of them.
Yeah. Now, the one to the left of it, how many triangles? All triangles, isn't it?
Yeah, a few of them are kind of curved, though.
If you go back and look at something like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
That's a classic. I love that.
But again, how many triangles?
A fair few, or at least just squares that have been squished.
They've been cut in diagonal, which makes 2 triangles.
Right, of course. Squares are made of triangles. Oh man, that's what happens when you drop maths. That makes sense of the German expressionism thing. I think I've noticed a small trend, especially for some reason in like more ambiguous or like cosmic horror, like movies like The Void, Midsummer. There are a few more cosmic horror movies that have just like this huge triangle focus. Yeah, there's a specific word for it. The Egyptians were big fans of them. I digress. Before I start saying misinformation directly to the audience, I'll go to Joy. This is where I wanted the eye to be led in the direction of the right and upward. All of these are not all consistent to the trend that I announced, because I noticed the trend as I got to the end. So they're not all consistent. Also, a lot of small shapes. Very whimsical. That's the wrong way around. I don't know. I think you got to rotate it anti-clockwise. Same philosophy here. Can't explain this one. And I think there's something whimsical about the circles. As you were saying, like we just got into that beforehand, they're a very, very uniform kind of peaceful shape.
That reminds me of something I was going to say. A variation, let's call this training wheels level, that we've been doing so far. We want to go into the tricycle level would be to pick only one shape at a time. How well can you illustrate aggression with only circles?
I don't think very well at all.
There's the challenge, right?
Which brings me to fear. Oh, no, anger. So I go to anger, which was a lot of big shapes all over the place, pointing in the wrong direction. However, it's an elevated emotion, so it's right at the top for me. Like it's active. Dominating the frame. It's all about the big rectangles dominating the frame, making smaller things difficult to see, or just kind of a progressive something exploding outward, maybe.
Yeah, okay.
Or even just a huge wall, something literally stopping our central character from getting into the other side of the frame.
Or the other way around, like this for some reason makes me think of, the guy in the Tiananmen Square stopping the tank in China, in Beijing.
Oh, I see that. Yeah, no, I was like, huh? And yeah, no, I understand.
Like one against a big mass.
That's a bit like that. I am so sorry to compare this to a fun Disney movie, but that's a bit like that Star Wars frame that I mentioned last time we talked about this. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
The one thing against this huge force.
I guess if you're putting it that way, it's like if Picasso did walkers.
Yeah. This is the Picasso version of Luke's final stand of The Last Jedi. We're on Surprise. This one was all over the place, man. I wanted an erratic rhythm. I found was the most kind of useful way of doing this. The general trend here was unpredictability. The eye is kind of led in a strange direction with strange shapes arranged strangely. Like for example, here you're looking in this direction and there's nothing there. Huh? That's too coherent. That one's not part of Surprise. Shoo, out of here. No. Yeah. Thoughts?
I'm not going to comment on any individual. Does XYZ image communicate exactly what you're saying that your intention was? There is always going to be room for interpretation. There's always going to be outliers in terms of the viewers. There's always going to be some viewer who, because of particular circumstances, the mood they're in, something happened to them before they're watching it, they're going to interpret things completely, wildly differently. I don't think with these kind of things that we are ever going to get a 100% communication rate. Does that make sense?
What we're dealing with is too abstract and emotions are too visceral to have a fully objective criticism of what's happening on the screen.
We have a good batting rate if there's a trend in the interpretation of the audiences.
Yeah, I think that overall, this exercise kind of served a purpose in that it's given me an idea of what I think certain emotions should look like on the screen, basically, in terms of arrangement, which is something I'd never given any thought to before, ever. What I'm working with here would be leading lines.
leading lines don't have to be straight.
No. Yeah.
So can you see that if you just pick any random day,
I'll pick surprise because,
pick the one on the very right. Can you see how if you draw a line through the center point of each object, part of leading lines aren't seen as lines directly, but the grouping and arrangement suggests lines, or the grouping or arrangement falls along an imaginary or invisible line?
I think I was definitely working with the latter, like the idea that what I'm arranging is working on an invisible line that I'm using for reference.
It could be worth starting looking into some Gestalt design theory. You probably do that right now just to get an idea. So if you go and Google Gestalt Laws of Perceptual Organization, whichever one will do.
You've mentioned these to us.
Laws of perceptual organization, right?
Yeah.
And isn't organization a synonym or very similar to arrangement, which makes it very similar to composition?
All right.
Gestalt principles, I wouldn't necessarily call them laws, but just having an awareness of them is quite good. I'm not sure if you're aware of it yourself, but you are becoming more conscious of the use of negative space.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think that over my entire time at the course, but also just generally when talking about arrangement, I've become much more aware of the fact that negative space is something. I started with this perception that it's like it is a lack of something. Like it isn't something, but it is something. If that's a good way of putting it.
Overall takeaways from the exercise?
Overall takeaways was that I kind of discovered where my personal trends were in terms of the way that I displayed certain things, a lot of the subconscious things, like the fact that I was putting things on certain lines, how certain shapes applied to certain meanings for me. It was honestly a very, very good way of figuring out the trends that defined how I perceived certain emotional responses on screen. However, because it was the first time doing it, I can't just use that as a universal reference book because obviously there are a few flaws. There are a few of them where I did it and went, you told me this yesterday. This exercise would do very nicely with some persistence, at least weekly.
You got to do the reps.
Absolutely, yeah. Doing the reps.
Part of that, I would very, very strongly suggest, like we said, do a different emotion for each image. So I would suggest print up, can you find I don't know, the more the better. Now that I think of it, 20 words for different emotions might be a stretch, but if we could manage to get that far, I think that would be fantastic. Print them up on a sheet of paper, cut up so you get individual pieces of paper for each emotion, put them in a hat or a bowl or whatever, and literally draw one per image.
Kind of a flashcard strategy, which is very helpful.
Yeah, I think the next one would be not to throw shade on your frame.
It's not very well made. I made it while I sat down and watched a Mimic and got a pair of scissors and stabbed the foam board. Occasionally would go what's happening in Mimic? And then would keep going.
Let me try this then. I think it'd be good for you to go beyond the edge more.
Oh, yeah.
With the thickness of that artboard, it's difficult to overlap the edge. My initial thought was rather than go the artboard, go thick paper and do the shapes in thick paper as well, so that you could actually push things under the edge so they go beyond the edge of the frame.
Gotcha, yeah.
But now that I'm thinking of it, I'm wondering if a better way might not be to invert it. And by that, I mean, if you take a black background, like an A3, and put a white sheet of A4 on top of it, then to get beyond the edge, you don't actually have to try and tuck under anything. It's much easier to slide beyond the edge.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay.
I'm kind of wondering whether having the frame on top mentally lock you inside the frame.
It might, yeah. Also because it's quite chunky. It did actually, as you said, it was 3 or 7 millimeter.
So I'm wondering whether that is more conducive to make you explore beyond the edge. And by extension, also then, that arranging leading line that you're working with, kind of in your mind be drawing that beyond the frame.
Because we're looking for open framing, not closed framing. On the persistence note, I am really interested by the Gestalt Laws thing. I recently put up some posters in my room, some framed, nice framed posters. I've got The Empire Strikes Back is right there, directly above the camera, and The Shining is right there. Because it's right in front of my desk, there's a bit of negative space here and a bit of negative space here. Thinking of putting things that are relevant to the craft up just to look at occasionally. That feels like something that I'd want to have in front of me on a regular basis. The just Gestalt laws of perception situation. So I feel like I would probably get a whiteboard and just pin that to the whiteboard. And every now and then just go, that's something I want to keep in mind. I like that concept.
Variation on this as well, which I guess kind of comes to the next level, if that makes sense. It's kind of thinking of these leading lines in terms of the energy and the energy of the rhythm of the lines. So, for example, could you illustrate anger only with curving lines?
Ah, right. Yeah.
If you could only use single lines rather than shapes, could you illustrate anger with a curving lines? Because I think the gut instinct would be to kind of do angled, jaggedy lines, right? For something like anger or aggression.
That's kind of what I approached it with.
Then the challenge, can you do that with only curves? And vice versa, could you do tranquility with only angled lines?
So kind of like there's a certain methodology you want to apply where you're trying to push certain like unconventional means of conveying an emotion as far as they can get to see how it can be done.
The Matrix, the whole thing about seeing the truth, there is no spoon.
Yeah.
This isn't the only way of seeing things. The interesting thing here for me as well, I kind of get the feeling that this composition part, out of everything we've spoken about, has been the furthest outside your wheelhouse. Am I right in saying that? Is that, or am I misreading things?
I think composition is very, very dependent on blocking. And I think that even though in our major works, there was like a level of coordination that we reached together that was quite good, I don't think I've reached that level of coordination with the director yet. Any other ones that I've worked with, that being 2. Most of my composition is just, where's the character sitting? Where are the other people sitting? How do I add depth to this? What will it look like? Like it's, it's very dry. It's the kind of conversation that I didn't know how to have with a director or to have it at all, if you know what I mean.
For me, it's more a matter of occasionally I will get a director who's sort of going, for example, I like rule of thirds, or I like Fibonacci, or they may have 1 or 2 specific frames in their mind that for this particular moment, I really, really would like to do X, Y, Z. So, for example, I've had one director I've worked a bit with liked for a certain moment to think of quadrants as in kind of like a quad split screen, and mentally with them would try and arrange furniture and things so that we hinted at having 4 distinct zones within the frame, and then would do the staging so that at a certain point, one character would be in this quadrant, one character would be in this quadrant, and then at a certain point, they would swap that way or swap each other's quadrants.
That's the thing. I think that my work in that regard at the absolute entry level that I'm at right now has been limited to I was not involved in staging, or I wasn't involved in production design. I wasn't involved in the arrangement of furniture or the art department. And I feel like the more coordinated, from what I'm hearing, the more coordinated a DP is, this kind of applies to every single role, and the more professionally they approach this kind of thing, and the more planning they're given, the more their interests branch out into every other department. They'll begin to ask the director what the blocking is, the production design, how the room is being furnished, if they can actually have a say in that.
There are definite reasons behind all the DP jokes in the industry.
What are the DP jokes? Sorry,
no, not those kind of DP jokes. Get your minds out of the gutter.
I don't get it. I don't know what he's talking about.
The most common one is, what's the difference between God and a DP? God doesn't think he's a DP.
Oh, damn. Okay.
A lot of jokes go around about DPs and their egos.
Oh, man. I mean, because I'm kind of thinking about a lot of the ones that I've heard of, like on the huge scale. I'm like, isn't that kind of like, it worked out great, but isn't that kind of invasive? And that's because I'm me. This is all actually how it's done in real life. I was shocked when I found out that, I don't know if you've heard of this movie, guys, but it's called Dune.
I'm wondering if we don't need to rechristen this reference to Doona because it's starting to feel a bit like a security blanket.
It is a security blanket. Anyway, I'll persist. I found out
So
that
the
Greg Fraser.
Doona,
I'll leave it. Whatever. It's fine. Go do the research. Find out what Greg Fraser did for Dune in the production design. It's all good.
a lot of the jokes are coming, and the perception of ego is coming from the highest level. When you really are getting into the higher level of ambition and complexity of the art of cinematography, you have involvement in so much. And I guess in some ways that makes sense because, at least for live action production, you are the head of department through which everything funnels, i.e., the lens. Like every activity on set is focused towards getting an image through the lens, right?
That makes sense. I suppose if you're the part of the department that is in charge of the image while making a movie, you'd be in charge of a fair bit.
And because so much then eventually affects us, we want to have a say. We want to not necessarily make the decisions, but we know what can improve and take away from the overall appearance of the story in images. So a lot of it as well is, for me at least, it's that balance between the so-called magic of movies, as in the make-believe, versus the actual tangible reality of what is in front of the camera when we're shooting. So there's the balance between, like, how we can make things appear differently on screen versus what's the limit of that. So the example I tend to give to directors is, if you want a pink giraffe on screen, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier if you give me a pink giraffe rather than a green elephant. So by that, I mean, if you want like a clean, high-tech, futuristic feel, there's only so much I can do in camera and lighting. If you give me kind of derelict, weathered 15th century farmer's village, there's only so much I can do to make it look clean, high-tech. As the person who's kind of considering what happens when the tangible reality in front of camera actually comes out on the other side of the camera, i.e. in the actual image, then when I see things like that, for example, if one department's decisions are leading in a different direction than another department's, then I feel like I have a place to speak up and make other suggestions.
I think it's kind of a difference between the perception that we have at the level that I'm at, like with my student films and stuff, is that the DP is the person who knows cameras and lights. And then at a certain level, it sounds like when you think about, for example, to circle back, arrangement and arranging things on screen, the things on screen eventually kind of just develops into everything. Like certain cinematographers who had a say in how sets were built in like specific movies. That's still arrangement. He's still arranging, how much of this wall is on this part of the camera, how much room will these characters have in the space.
I think that's a really important lesson as well, is when it comes to actual shooting, the way we're changing the arrangement on screen is by arranging the physical tangibilities in front of the camera.
So far, at my level, arrangement means furniture and characters, and I am not getting involved with furniture. Mentally, I think I need to branch out and be more annoying.
It's not so much about that. It's more about having that awareness about how do you maximize, particularly when you start out. It's about maximizing what resources and the time you have available. The other side to that, I think very often as well, particularly when we start out, lighting is usually what's the most time consuming. Cinematographers, DPs tend to have quite a big say in schedule for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm open enough to say that both myself and the profession, there have been times when when I have hammed it up, played myself up more than was probably warranted at the time, played on that kind of I'm the person in the know, a little bit of that building up your self-confidence, faking it till you make it, and all that kind of stuff, I think is
fake it till you make it
has
a fun one.
has played into the perception and the jokes about DPs.
Right. To circle back,
Leading line arrangement is a circle, is it?
it is. That's right. It's right. We've got a.
You have actually arranged this episode.
I actually arranged this episode. I'm actually God. Did you know that?
So you're a DP then?
We had a bit of a surface scratch there of what I think we should talk about next time. Pre-production. You mentioned a bit of like what you should be prioritizing. Depending on where you publish, it's a good segue.
This is one thing that has baffled me a lot with students. The misconception of the cinematographer role or any other key creative for that matter, be that editor or art director or whomever. There seems to be very much a misconception, a misunderstanding of the being a creative head of department or a key creative as a big part of that role. And being a head of department, a creative head of department, and being a key creative means offering options, taking ownership of the areas that are going to influence your creative work. This is something that I find quite fascinating, the differences in perception from current generation of beginner filmmakers to previous generations of beginner filmmakers is that perception of the key creative, the head of department creative. Can I ask, what was your perception of, for example, a cinematographer or an editor or a production designer?
Going into it, generally, I was kind of all of these roles felt very, very independent of one another. But especially post advanced cinematography and then going into the short film production, I was very happy to have adopted the approach that, for example, the DP is someone's boss. I am a coach / boss if I'm going to be the DP of something for the first AC and the camera operator and all these people. Like it's also kind of a coaching role. It is extremely collaborative with the rest of the group. So there's no real independent work at all. I was constantly consulting other people. I think that my change of perception was that it was very people focused.
It seems to be initially for a lot of students, the perception of the cinematographer is as a glorified camera operator and being someone who's waiting for instructions, i.e. being told what is the shot going to be by the director.
I did initially think that the consequences of auteur theory on the wider world. I fully used to think the director was behind everything and was in charge of the image, basically. Like the cinematographer, I was like, what's the point? Isn't the director in charge of the image? I think everyone enters that sphere with a really director focused mindset, and it's not helped by like social media and everything. Everyone's always talking about the director.
The frustrating thing is that for me, it follows on. I'm still seeing a lot of students not taking responsibility and taking charge of their department.
I was very happy with myself when I entered production in Converse because like I kitted out the camera department. Like the second I took the DP role, I was like, I'm gonna look for this person and then this person, and then and it was just me doing that mentally and then asking the producer if it was okay.
The way I see it is you're only as good as your crew.
Yeah, I wanted a crew that I knew how to work with, really nicely.
This really ties into the coaching function of creative leadership as well. Like if you think about it, if you're going to take a team, like say a soccer team, and put them up against regional champions or like Australian champions or whatever, are you just going to go with whatever players you are given, or would you rather pick the players yourself?
Yeah, right. You'd rather pick the players yourself, and then
same as the head of department. They're going to act as your hands and feet. They're the ones who, on the tangible hands-on level, are going to implement your plans and your vision. So it's really, in my opinion, you're not helping yourself at all if you let those decisions be made by others.
I wanted people who I could trust to do things for me, because it could just be the consequences of being an early and kind of finicky, like antsy DP situation. I was very hands off. Like I am not a big fan of operating or being near the camera or anything. I'm a very big fan of saying, hey, first AC, please move this. It is definitely like I'm scared of the camera situation. but also it worked. And I, crewed up with people who I knew they could handle the camera.
I just had a thought on all that. How much of this kind of downplaying of the management, coaching, team leader kind of role do you think has to do with students not having seen what a proper experienced crew brings?
Oh, it almost like 80 to 90% of it. I mean, frankly, my experience with the live set that we did at JMC was very scary from a camera department perspective. Like that was like I finished that going like, ugh, like yuck, like, and it was just this horrible feeling of like, wow, that's what I've not yet had the time to grow used to because I've been doing student films where we all know each other, you know? Like that's something that I need to experience more often. And there's definitely, I think that students should be encouraged more to just kind of throw themselves into the crucible and like let themselves kind of suffer the culture shock of an actual crew initially, because the only time I'd been on like a proper set before that was in Try One with like a very recent JMC alumni group who all knew each other. The energy wasn't very intense at all, whereas the live set was literally felt professional. And I also ruined a take, so that was rough.
Do you want the bad news?
Yeah, that's how it is.
Do you know the movie Zoolander?
Yeah.
You know when they're trying to get the files from the computer?
Yeah,
and they go like, oh, the files are in the computer. That's what the live sets look like to me.
Awesome. That's fantastic. I mean, it was a bunch of students, wasn't it?
Yeah, those kind of experiences when you really start appreciating, wow, okay, this is what having a crew is about. Shooting close up on a curved track on an 85mm at T2, and out of 5 takes, 4 of them were usable for focus without marks.
I think that these student film sets were at least Converse was like well organized, and our first AD was good at keeping us going, and also I think suitably angry about everything to make him feel like a first AD, like a real first AD. Like that, there was a sense of urgency and like, for example, I like spoke to my friends who brought on as an extra, and I was like, "How is that? What would it feel like?" Because I was in like flow state the whole time, and they're like, "Yeah, that was hectic," but everything seems to be working like a well-oiled machine. Everyone knew each other. Everyone was comfortable with each other. Everyone was comfortable making small mistakes. Whereas if I am selling myself to a set, I'm not comfortable making mistakes because I've set an expectation around strangers.
My first like kind of aha moment, this is what crew is about, was the first experienced industry focus puller I worked with, where the slate came in shot and it was in focus, and the focus dropped back to the action without me having seen him lay down any tape measure or put down any tape marks.
Oh man.
That's when you go, oh, okay, all right. Yeah, I'm starting to get it. And later on was working fairly high budget TV commercials with an AC whom I'd met on the day before on the gear pickup, and halfway through lunch, people going, so how often have you worked together? First job.
You seemed familiar. Like it was, yeah.
That's kind of, again, that level of experience and professionality you recognize. To sum that part of it up is you really realize the value of experienced, knowledgeable, skilled crew when they tell you what you need to do. When you can stop worrying about what they're doing and they're actually telling you.
Wonderful. I love being told what to do. Yeah. It's fantastic. All right, to sum today up, we've had a big chat. We started with the arrangement, talked about how it manifested in my actual emotional response to images. We've moved on a bit to what arrangement means, how it can extend depending on, the DP, and how the role of the DP kind of branches out to affect the entire crew and the cast and everything just for arrangement. And then we talked a bit about industry expectations. And as a final note, I think that for me, the ideal but extremely unrealistic first professional set experience is just stand there and watch things happen.